Welcome to another episode of the Preparing for Pregnancy After Loss podcast. I am here with Nicole JeanBaptiste, who is beautiful and glowing inside and out. She is one of the people who I really admire in the birthing space. We also know that it is Black History Month. I saw Nicole post something the other day about Black history and Black futures, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have to talk to Nicole this month. We can't allow the month to end without centering the experience of Black people within birth world. And so Nicole will be sharing some of her wisdom with us. So without further ado, welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for having me. It is my ultimate pleasure to share with you and just hold space with you. Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. So I'll give you an opportunity to intro yourself and tell us who you are. There's obviously so much to who you are, but within the perspective of this conversation.
Thank you for that opportunity. I am a birth worker. I am a birth enthusiast. I'm a birth justice advocate. I'm an advocate for upholding and reclaiming the sacredity and the ceremony that is birth. I am someone who is pro-Black, and in doing that, I am intentionally working toward a solution to anti-Blackness, right? Let's see, what else? Who else am I? I am the mother to two children, one who is 13, another who will be 5 soon. I'm a trained oral historian with a specific interest in the stories of folks of African descent. And I'm a lifelong Bronx resident and a lover of all the things that will get us closer and closer to liberation as a people.
Amazing. Beautiful. So tell us what led you to birth work.
It was my first experience with birth just about 13 years ago. So it's also really, I think, fitting that we're having this talk now, and my oldest son will be 13 next week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, in part, it was his birth that led me to birth work. And I say that because I've always had a propensity toward all things birth and pregnancy. Like, I was the child who was not at all interested in watching cartoons or the other shows that kids my age were watching. Instead, I was tuned into the Learning Channel, which was, I think, probably like the TV sphere's first introduction to what reality TV was, but just not in as raunchy or degrading of a way.
Yeah.
And on the TLC, one of the things, like, they would have like these home makeover shows, right? Though that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in the shows that dealt with following people throughout their pregnancy journeys and at the births. There was this one show in particular called The Maternity Ward, and I was just hooked because I had never seen birth on TV depicted in that way. I will also point out that it was very rare to see Black people on this show.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, what made up for it was the realness and the absence of like romanticization over being real in this show. Yeah. So I got to see up close and personal, like, wow, she's in the thick of labor, and the person may or may not have been in control and and composed. But I was able to see another side of birth, and it really it called to me. And like at a really young age, I was just any fear that could have been built within me around the process of being pregnant and having a baby really just escaped, and for like a good reason. And I was happy about that. So from that moment on, I knew that I wanted to do something that had to deal with this process of life,
Right.
bringing forth life. And for a while, I thought, okay, I'm going to become an obstetrician. I got to college, I started pre-med, and I was just like, no, I'm not doing that. Then I said, okay, I'll try nursing. I just wasn't getting, it was overly clinical for me. What I wanted to experience was the human to human connection that I felt I could bring to the space. And then I discovered midwifery. While I was in college, I was told by my advisor that midwifery was becoming obsolete. And I wrongfully believed this person. You know, I had a lot of trust in my college advisor, right? And we see now that this person was drastically wrong. And then I think, you know, once that became like a reality for me, that I in part contributed to, like I made these decisions to discover or pursue pre-med, and then finally think about midwifery, and then say no. And then I returned to my second love, which is African and African American studies. And, you know, I devoted my college career to that. Once that decision was made, I became pregnant like within a year, and I was very excited about this. Like I was prepared. I watched TLC, you know. And in addition to that, within my studies of the Black experience through my degree program, one of the things that was uplifted for me in a way that I had not known it prior to that was African matriarchy and African matriarchal societies, and within them the role of mothers having just bearing so much weight. And you know, there's almost like it was the way in which I learned about motherhood and how it was revered in African matriarchal societies was as though when you become a mother, regardless of the age, you experience almost like an ascension, you know? And so I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I want to do that. Like, you know, this is going to grant me instant, like, elevated respect within my sphere. Little did I know, you know, or of course I knew it. I'm living in a society where mothers are not valued in the ways that we should be, right? Where birth is not valued in the way that it should be and honored. However, I did not connect those two dots. So I'm going in with the armor of childbirth education vis-a-vis TLC and my knowledge of African matriarchal societies and the great respect that birth and parenthood has on Black women. I'm thinking this is going to be a wonderful experience. So I'm looking forward to it. So, you know, even though I was receiving care at a place that, you know, I just was not receiving quality care. You know, think about waiting for 2 hours in a busy and crowded waiting room only to be seen by my provider for about 5 minutes. I was still very excited for the experience of labor and birth. And then fast forward to later in my pregnancy, it must have been about week 37, where I was told that I would need to have a C-section. And I was just very, very devastated by that. I was told I needed to have the C-section, not because, you know, I was unhealthy or the baby was in danger, but because he was breech. And, you know, what we've learned is that the support by medical providers of people whose babies are breech presenting is no longer something that's taught in schools. You know, This is it's absolutely something that's possible. It's a skill that traditional midwives still hold onto and are able to perform, right? But in traditional or typical hospital spaces that we know today, that this is not the norm. Right. So I was scheduled to have a C-section. And then the other thing that happened around that time was I had 3 other friends. So it was a total of 4 of us all pregnant around the same time. Out of the 4 of us, 3 of us had C-sections. And I'm just thinking something is odd about that. I know my grandmother and my mother did not do this way. In fact, my mother had 4 children vaginally, the first of whom was born breech, and it was not an issue. Yeah. You know, so that there made me question, like, how would this have gone down if I had had some support? Yeah. You know, in retrospect, I learned that there were a number of things I could have done in response to learning that my baby was breech, and I didn't have the support in the form of a professional to suggest those things. Right. You know, so these are the ways that I was ushered into birth work.
Got it. Beautiful. So you also mentioned that you're trained as an oral historian. What brought you to that?
Yeah. So I've always had an interest in just the uncovering of our history, you know, because we know for the many reasons that it was buried, right? And just truly believing and knowing that we have this richness and just being really committed through, and, you know, that was demonstrated through my commitment to completing a degree in African and African American studies. Yeah. Being really committed to devoting my life to continuing to honor this and to demonstrate pride and to learn as much about my heritage as I possibly could. Yeah. And in doing so, one of the very obvious things, like, you don't have to go to school to learn this. We come from a people whose traditions were oral. You know, we have our griots, we have our storytellers, children and adults would sit around and at the feet of the elder in the community and listen to stories. And this is how history was passed down. So I was very aware of that. I had not known that oral history was a discipline. You know, I think that also speaks to just like the academicization of things that are just inherently a part of us. So, and to give you an example of that, you know, a lot of the work that I had been doing prior to, like, formally becoming an oral historian was oral history. I just didn't know it. So, for example, after I graduated from college, I applied for a Fulbright grant, and I was awarded this grant, and on the premise that I would execute a project that I designed, and the project revolved entirely around collecting oral histories. I just wasn't calling it that. I was saying, I'm going to go out and I'm going to interview people and collect these primary resources and ask them about their recollections and their motives based on both their present and their memory. Yeah. Right. So I had done that. And then, to be completely honest with you, when I came home, I said, you know, I should probably go get a master's degree. I just don't want to spend a whole lot of time pursuing this thing. And it's really important to me to do it in a field that means something to me. And then I discovered that oral history was a master's degree subject at Columbia, and you know, I got into the program.
Amazing. Wow. How has this background in oral history, how has that showed up in birth work?
Okay. I'm going to share the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know that it exactly answers the question, but I think that it's related. So when I entered into this program, it was a 1-year master's degree program. I was the only person in that program of, I want to say, maybe like 10 to 12 students who knew exactly what they wanted to study. And I mean, I expected everybody to know also, because we didn't have that much time. We had a year, an academic year, which is like 10 months to complete this work. So what I knew for sure, for certain, I wanted to do was collect the oral histories of women of African descent to trace the evolution of birthing practices amongst us and link that to the history of midwifery in the American South.
Wow.
So, you know, the history, and I mean, if you want to, you know, just in very basic terms, a lot of that looked like collecting 3-hour-long birth stories from people. And those are things that I do all the time in this work. You know, like you can't, I'll never say to someone like, miss me with your birth story. You know, I'm always wanting to listen to birth stories, as I think most birth workers are, you know. So in that sense, many of us are oral historians. Like you were a living vessel of these histories. You know, you're storing them now. So in every way, I think that oral history is connected to doula work, to birth work.
Yeah. What's coming to mind for me is that I learned so much on your page. It's Sese Doula, right? I want to make sure. Okay, Sese Doula on Instagram. I learned so much about our history and our culture, and even what's happening right now in the birthing world, whether it is injustice or celebration. I feel like you are the news channel that I get to learn all of those things from.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. That 100% is the purpose of my page. I mean, my little corner of the internet. You know, when I started it, one of the things I really wanted to make sure I did was allow for a space where Black birth, Black pregnancy, Black parenthood, Black activism and advocacy, and just our voices, regardless of what the subject was, were being uplifted. Because, I mean, it's only recent that we're seeing wider representation in pregnancy and birth. You know, it's like, still, it's pretty difficult to find images of Black birthing people. It's difficult, like quality images, you know. The social media had just been saturated with depictions of pregnancy and support, also doula support, as though this were only something reserved for white people. You know, so I was really just like, this is ridiculous. You know, like let's celebrate this. And I'm glad that, you know, you're finding my page as a source of information.
Yeah, definitely.
Hopefully inspiration too.
Definitely both. Yeah. Okay, so I did not know that you went into oral history with the intention of tracing this link within midwifery. So this is awesome. So looking at, going back to that knowledge, what are some things that people don't know about the origins of midwifery?
Wow. I'll say that this was largely a field, a profession that was controlled and led and operated by Black and Indigenous women in this country. And like, I'm speaking specifically to the United States. Right. And so in that way, like, this is what people, like, you hear more often today activists and advocates for birth and birth justice, saying that Black and Indigenous women, we birthed this nation. We literally did. You know, like just tracing the roots of the transatlantic slave trade to the shores of what is now the United States, and considering the fact that this business of enslaving African bodies was based upon the ability of our ancestors to work and to breed children. You know, like this was a critical component.
Right.
You know, to have these children who were able-bodied to be ushered into this world safely and in a way that was healthy was really critical. You know, so the midwives within various communities, and I'm also like reluctant to name these as communities, because you know, one of the things that does is it connotes like you know, a certain level of safety and functionality when there was a hell of a lot of dysfunction here. At the same time, in spite of all of that, we were forming communities and we were building families. But in the context that I'm speaking now, I'm referring to capitalism's reliance on the continuation of Black lineages, so that for the sole purpose of upholding this business that was planting crops and picking the crops and working in the fields and you know, maintaining and building up this country.
Right.
Yeah, so that's one thing I would say. You know, historically, midwifery is a field that has been created, led by, operated by Indigenous and Black women in this country. The other thing that's important to know is that there was a very deliberate campaign that was created and executed to smear the name and the reputation of midwifery here. Right. And that was done for the sole purposes of commodifying the practice. So this is where you begin to see the emergence of nurse midwives and the requirement of licensure for midwives. So you had these grand midwives who were taught through oral tradition and apprenticeship how to do their work. Right. Many of whom, because a direct result of racism and enslavement, were not literate. They were brought into now institutions where they were being required to complete these courses of study and fulfill these requirements to become licensed. Like it's totally, you're setting up swaths of people to not do well. And still, in spite of all of those challenges, many of the grand midwives of our history did become licensed midwives, and they continued to practice. And many of them continued to practice in a very underground sort of way. You know, so this legacy is so rich. It's laced with resistance. It's laced with, you know, just power and esteem, and the literal understanding that the growth and continuation of whole communities, of whole families, was resting upon the important work that was being done.
Wow. Ooh. Okay. more history lessons. Tell us about the field of gynecology and how that began, the history of that, because I don't think many people know. I hesitate to call it the contribution of Black women, but I doubt that most people know how that field was developed. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would like wholeheartedly say that one thing that needs to be elevated more is the contribution of Black women, particularly enslaved Black
Mhm,
women,
mhm,
to the fields of obstetrics and gynecology.
mhm,
There is a contemporary scholar by the name of Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens who writes and speaks extensively
mhm.
about this very contribution.
Yeah.
There are three enslaved women whose names we know them to be as they were recorded as Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha, who contributed immensely to who we also have been taught to revere as the father of gynecology, Dr. Jane Marion Sims. And in short, these three women were his test subjects.
Mhm.
And, he's credited with the invention of the forceps device, which is something that, as people who go for their regular OBGYN visits is an instrument that we're very familiar with, right? So really, no pun intended, instrumental, right? And this is the person being given credit for this. Um, Meanwhile, what's not often talked about up until recently is that these three Black women, among others, were without their consent
Right.
and without the benefit of anesthesia, were tested upon. So imagine a doctor performing an operation on you, on your reproductive organs,
Mhm.
and you were not consenting to this. Not only are you not saying that this is okay, but you're not being given the benefit of some sort of pain relief. You're feeling all of this,
Yeah.
and these are people who survive these experiments.
Yeah.
These are people who are not given the credit that they deserve from the findings of these experiments.
Yeah.
And much of what we know today about gynecology is based upon the work that was done
Right.
by Dr. Sims on these enslaved African women. And I would encourage everyone who is working with people, particularly Black people of reproductive age, to go and do some more research. A great place to start is with Dr. Cooper Owens's work. And yeah, like these are the stories that need to be told, and these are the roots of the current situation that we are seeing unfold, where birth and disparities amongst Black and Indigenous and people of color are being seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you for sharing all of that. And what we're seeing now, it's so complex. So one thing that made me think about is in my work that involves, healing of the body and the emotions that are left there, and how we carry these things in our genes. So our ancestors who were experimented on, like that lived in their bodies and was passed on in the bodies of their children. And so even though it's been so many years that slavery was abolished, we do know that some form of enslavement exists today. So we continue to see the injustice in the world, but we're also still holding the memories and the emotions from those experiences that we still need to heal. And so, as a Black birthing person going into the hospital, I want to say that it's understandable that there is fear and hesitation and concern.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, lots of the fear and concern that we're seeing a lot of people present today, whether it's explicit, like, hi, I found you on Instagram and I'm seeking out your services because I'm afraid
Right.
to birth in a hospital, or it's the person who is oblivious to this, current situation and the history behind it, yet every time that they show up in a doctor's office, they are demonstrating symptoms of white coat syndrome. Like that, these responses that show up in our bodies, they have roots, and like you mentioned, in some ways, they are very, very deep roots.
Right.
So I 100% believe, I know these are founded fears and concerns. I think now it's time to shift the focus to, like, how do we address them? How do we combat them so that they are not the thing that is the most prominent in the experience of birth for our people? What do we do to counter this fear so that the outcome is not a traumatic birth experience? And then I'll also say that some of these things are not within our control. And by that I mean that it's really important to identify the root cause of an issue. And in this case, we've identified it as systemic racism. And that stems from the industry within which the majority of birthing people are having their children, right? So if we know that to be true, then we know some serious changes need to happen within this same industry.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking of the medical industrial complex.
Yeah, I would love for you to expand on that, because I don't know that enough people see it that way, see how it's set up as that system. So share more about that.
Yeah. So when we're speaking about the medical industrial complex, we are speaking about the entire system through which birthing people are, I'll say, funneled through, and I'm not implying that this is involuntary. For the most part, most birthing people go to the hospital. And this is where they receive prenatal care, or through some sort of hospital system. So whether it's a clinic or, the actual hospital. So they're receiving care during their pregnancy, and this is where they're deciding to have their babies, right? And all of the entire system is, as we know it, is related. So we have the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies and the providers and the hospital staff. And if we look back in time, one of the things that we'll uncover is that there is a clear linkage between the overthrow of midwifery, the rise of obstetrics and gynecology, which, as was previously mentioned, had very much to do with the coercion and abuse and just totally foul treatment of enslaved African women, or descendants of African women.
Yeah.
So to know that there's that clear link up until the point in which we have this major healthcare system, and we're seeing undeniable, highly disproportionate disparities in birthing outcomes for Black women, for women who identify as non-white, and for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Right? To recognize those elements, there's no way to not see the clear link between this medical industrial complex and systemic racism and capitalism.
Yeah.
It has always been, the impetus has always been capitalism as a motive, right? It's the form has changed over time, right? So we started with the enslavement of Black bodies, and we morphed into something else now, right? Yeah. So that's an overview of the medical industrial complex. And, I think that it's no coincidence that within this system, Black birthing people are disproportionately mistreated. Our children have poorer outcomes. We have poorer outcomes. We're having near miss experiences at exponentially higher rates than our white counterparts. We're having actual losses at exponentially higher rates than our counterparts.
Yeah.
And that's something that can't be denied.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm remembering it was last year, and what I'm thinking is that all that we're learning about Black maternal death, these things were already happening, but there's more attention placed on it now because of the shift that our country is going through. And I remember almost like month after month seeing on your page that this person died in childbirth, this person died in childbirth, this person died in childbirth. And I remember each of those moments just like sitting down and allowing myself to just cry, just like allowing all of that like anger to bubble up, and that grief and all of that to bubble up, and just release with all of that. And I know that expectant parents are seeing that, and they're bringing in that fear into the hospital. I'm thinking of one pregnant mom, and I asked her in this session, like, what's the fear behind the fear? Like, what's the thing that you haven't told anyone yet, but you're holding that fear in your mind? And her response was, if the doctor has to choose between me and the baby, the doctor should choose the baby. And I was stunned, like, what? Like, as a pregnant person, that's what you're going in with, that you might not actually come back out and the baby should be chosen over you. And I was like, no, we need to like have a session to clear some of this stuff. Because when you go in with that fear, it shows up in your body, whether in the tightness or the tension, or, labor not progressing. So that affects your labor. So just so much has to be detangled, and so much has to be released. Something that you've shared before is that it's as though it's the doula's, the expectation is that the doula will make it right. The doula will help to ensure that you get to come out of the hospital alive. And while we have a part to play, we can't undo all the things and make all the things right. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on what parts the different parties can play, like what roles can be played.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't believe that doulas are the solution to what has been deemed a Black maternal health crisis. And the only reason I state it that way is because I'm actively working toward getting to a place where I'm not, using this terminology, because crises are not meant to last forever.
Yeah.
You identify that there's a problem and you work on the solution. Right now, I'm in solution mode. But for the purposes of explaining that, I use that term. But doulas as a solution is impractical. And I mentioned the reason a bit ago, which is that, if you have a leak in your home, right, like in your faucet, you're gonna try and track the source of the leak and patch it up where it's stemming from. In this case, the leak, and this is probably much too minuscule of an example, but the issue stems from systemic racism within these institutions where Black birthing people are dying. So the changes need to happen within them.
Yeah.
Right. And to be completely, like, if we're going to go all the way, much of this needs to be dismantled and built anew.
Yeah.
You know, so that's not a doula's role. You know, to be completely honest, like, we're still over here trying to be compensated fairly.
Yeah.
You know, so, and I mentioned that to say we're not even paid enough for that sort of work. And in spite of that, however, doulas are on the ground, you know, advocating and activating ourselves to ensure that policy changes are at least being moved and made.
Yeah.
Right. As far as what happens within these institutions, that is on the part of the institution, and there has to be some a deeper motivation to want to make these sorts of changes. And then again, we have to have some real conversations around, like, how capitalism functions. How is that going to affect someone's bottom line?
Yeah.
You know, and perhaps this is the reason why we have not seen much change.
Yeah.
I think that in terms of what are the things that birthing people can do, one is recognize, like you said, the fear behind the fear. That's one thing. And also recognize the options that are available to you.
Yes.
You know, and I say that with a lot of enthusiasm, although, like, in a place like New York City, there, quite frankly, are not many options, but we do have options, you know, so there is an alternative to birthing in the hospital. You can either birth in a birth center, or you can birth at home with a home birth midwife, right? And I think that, you know, a lot of what we have to do as community members is shift our perspective on what is normal, you know, quote unquote, and what is safe. You know, I think that for a lot of people, I am so sorry for that background noise. My son is playing the tuba. He's in music class right now, and I've never heard him play this emphatically. Home birth midwives, and shifting the focus or the perspective that people have on what is considered safe. I think that, you know, and to no fault of our own, we've been conditioned to think that once you see a lot of shiny machinery and medical instruments, that means I'm safe, I'm protected. When in actuality, these things are meant to be used in the case of an emergency. And there's so few birthing instances where it is an emergency. You know, the minority of births are actually high risk and actually warrant emergent care, whereas the majority are low risk and would absolutely, you know, meet the qualifications to birth with a home birth midwife at home or within a birth center. And I think that these are the things that people need to explore more. It needs to be normalized. Yeah, absolutely.
And that choice could absolutely make the difference between a traumatic birth or a gentle birth that feels supported, where you get to have, you know, movement and freedom in your body and in the room.
Most definitely.
Yeah. What was your second birthing experience like with your daughter? So having had the C-section, which was unexpected, unplanned, becoming a doula, what were things like for you the second time around?
I felt a lot more educated, a lot more informed about the process of birth. I mean, I had always held on to trust in the birthing experience. Like, that was something that I got from TLC. And I had that with my first experience. And so, but this time around, I was a lot more informed. I was a lot more educated. And I also had something that I didn't even need the first time, but now I needed this trust in my body, because the narrative that I was being sold was that, oh, once a C-section, always a C-section. And, you know, luckily I learned shortly after having my son the first time that that is not accurate. You can have a vaginal birth after having a C-section. For me, I was tasked with identifying the most likely way to have this happen. And what I came down to was that this would need to be done at home. That was my best bet, with a home birth midwife.
Wow.
And so, you know, having a home birth was very much an active resistance to a system that was telling me I could not do this thing that I knew I could do, and knew, based upon thorough research and just knowing, you know, like, here's where the oral history comes in. Like, I know my foremothers did not do it that way, you know, and I knew they did it the other way quite safely and securely. So really, you know, identifying how I could have the best shot at having this happen, and that was at home birth midwife, a doula. My sister was with me, my mother was with me, my partner, my son, my older son, you know, so just really feeling encircled by support and love. It was a long experience. It was a long haul. You know, in planning for a home birth, you also identify a backup hospital, which I did. 4 days into labor, many hours into pushing. And when I say many hours, it actually was many hours. I decided, you know what, maybe baby is like malpositioned, and I need to try something different. We headed to the hospital that's 5 minutes away. As soon as I got to the hospital, I gave birth to her vaginally, and she had high APGAR scores. All was well. And I did not feel like I lost anything. I was not tied to the idea of having the baby in the home. I was tied to the idea of having her vaginally without complication. And I was able to achieve that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. What I am convinced that after giving birth to a child, there's almost like there is fire that lights within you. I see you smiling. Tell me what's coming to mind.
Yeah, I'm smiling because if it really does, it feels like a feat, you know, regardless of how you birth this baby, you know, whether it's a cesarean or belly birth, or if it's a vaginal birth. I felt like, and I wish I had known that with my first child, I didn't get the same feeling in the same exact way, but I had this joke with my sister that, you know, after having my daughter vaginally, after having the C-section, I could do anything. And we would joke that I could now levitate. You know, like I have this very amazing power and ability that I've always had, but now I truly demonstrated it, you know. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Okay. So I met you through Bronx Rebirth, an amazing collective that is doing just such needed work in Bronx, in the community. So share more about what that is, what led to the creation of that, and the work that you've all been doing.
Sure. Yeah, Bronx Rebirth, we are a collective of Black birth workers based in the Bronx, and we created this project, this operation, in response to both COVID-19 and what we were seeing its effects be within our community, particularly with birthing and parenting people, and very directly in response to the death of Amber Rose Isaac at a Bronx hospital. At that point, we were just like fed up, beyond fed up, because we had, by we, I mean myself, Carmen Mojica, and Evelyn Alvarez, we had several conversations prior to this, each centered on, you know, the unfortunate death of another Black birthing person in a New York City hospital,
Right.
you know. So at this point we were like, this is ridiculous. You know, not only is this still happening, we're also being slammed by a major public health crisis,
Right.
you know, that our elected officials are not doing enough about. So BX Rebirth, within, I want to say, a week, we officially formed an operation to provide free diapers, wipes, and formula to families in the Bronx. And a few months after that, we mobilized a doula corps where we provide affordable doula services to people living in the Bronx. Natalie, you were one of our doulas, and you've served clients through this program. And, you know, one of the things that we're wanting to do is build up the Bronx's doulas workforce, right? As well as uplift the practice of paying doulas equitably.
Yeah.
While not like denying people the service because they're not able to pay,
Right.
you know, and all of this has been done through crowdsourced funding, and we're really proud of that. We continue to accept donations via our PayPal, which can be found at paypal.me/bxrebirth.
Awesome. And I'll include that in the show notes as well so that people can have access to that. I was about to say that from observing you and Carmen and Evelyn and seeing how you operate, I've just been really impressed. Like, this is just on a whole other level of, you know, community organization or collaborative work among women, so that there are, you know, whatever we would think of as being like the negatives of coming together and creating a thing, like I have been able to observe you show the positives from that. Yeah. So just the idea of having doulas be, you know, paid what the work is worth and delivering amazing service to birthing people, just that marriage, just that union is impressive.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will say that, you know, one of the beautiful things about our camaraderie is, you know, we're coming into it with our own life experiences and our respective inspirations. I can say, you know, for a fact that both Carmen and I are deeply inspired by the work of the Black Panther Party. And I know Carmen has mentioned a couple of times that leading up to doing the organizing work that started BX Rebirth, she had been delving even more deeply into the work of the Panther Party and, you know, learning the lessons that they teach about true coalition building and community organizing. So, you know, those are some of the things that, you know, propel us forward. And yeah.
Amazing. Cool. Any final thoughts you have on, you know, if we look at the futures part of where we are, so Black history, but also Black futures, any parting words on, you know, the how we can contribute to it, how we can be present to it and be active in creating the future that we do want?
Yeah, I would, my final words would be like, you know, we are powerful. there's power in our personhood, and there's power in our collectiveness. And what I would love to see in the future is there be a flip where the majority of folks are birthing outside of hospitals, and they are birthing with traditionally trained midwives, many of whom are descendants of indigenous people, are indigenous and Black, and folks who are non-white. And the interests of capitalism is not at the core of the work that we're doing, and we are thriving. I do believe that the two can exist. So those would be my parting words, that we can change the landscape of birth in this country and beyond. And I truly believe that much of that, I feel like there's more than one route to this. But I think very radically that rests with the people.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. My final question for you. What has been bringing you joy recently? We obviously have to end with Black joy.
Absolutely. What's been bringing me joy? Oh man. I got a hula hoop. And
oh my God.
Yeah, so that's been bringing me joy. I'm gonna post some videos soon of me hula hooping. And I didn't get it. I inherited it from my sister, whose apartment I have access to. And yeah, it's a weighted hula hoop. So hopefully this will, while I'm having some fun, this will also do me and my waist some good.
Yeah, amazing. Like as you said hula hoop, I felt my hips do a little thing. I had a body response.
Yes. The name hula hoop, it does that.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom in the midst of motherhood and all the things. You're making all of it happen beautifully. So thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom. And yes, I'll continue to follow you and learn from you on your page.
You are most welcome.
It's time, Mom. It's time. Back to me now.
I gave you your 90 minutes. Thank you so much, Natalie. Take good care.
All right, bye.
Thank you for tuning into this episode on honoring the Black birthing experience. And I'm sending so much appreciation to Nicole JeanBaptiste for sharing her wisdom with us and all the incredible work that she's been doing in this space. Do check out her Instagram. She's at sese_doula. That is SESE_doula on Instagram. And her website is sesedoulaservices.com. That's sesedoulaservices.com. She's been doing amazing work, so definitely check her out. So this episode was recorded when it was still February, but it is intentionally being released after February because the liberation of Black people is an all the time thing, right? It's an everyday thing, not just a thing that happens in the shortest month of the year in the middle of winter, right? If there are people who aren't being treated fairly, who aren't being treated justly, then I think it is our responsibility to ensure that that is changed, and we will continue to do that work until it is. And since this is the Preparing for Pregnancy After Loss podcast, and since many of you have experienced either loss or infertility, I wanted to share a few thoughts on the experiences of Black families in this space, right? Typically, not only is there the trauma of losing a pregnancy, an infant, or struggling through infertility, but there's often great harm that's done by the medical system, or harm that's done by the people in the medical system whose care we're in. So, this entire episode brought to light that our country's roots stem from racism. We already knew that, but I don't think we knew that within the context of the reproductive world, right? Within the context of midwifery or obstetrics or gynecology. And so it's really good to have that background. It's really good to have that information as we look at this from that perspective. Even though slavery in the form that it existed before is no longer a thing, there are still beliefs that are deeply embedded in our society that either stemmed from slavery or they were used to justify slavery. One of those beliefs is that Black people have a greater tolerance to pain. What that looks like today is that the medical team has this unconscious bias, has this assumption that a Black person experiencing pain, it might not be as bad because our tolerance is greater. What that means is that we're either not listened to, we're not believed, or we're not prioritized, right? Because we have the ability to handle pain at a higher rate than other groups can, which isn't true. Another belief or assumption that's sometimes made is that a Black person is uneducated, and so the same care isn't taken to explain procedures or practices to them. The same care isn't taken to give them the opportunity to make an informed choice. What often happens is that the choice is actually made for them, right? And I can give you so many other examples of how racism or discrimination shows its ugly head in hospitals or in these spaces where we are vulnerable and where we need protection. Another example is doctors asking their Black patients, Black birthing people who are there without their partners, asking them if they know who the father of their child is. Like, what? And also, how is that your business? Whew. Just had to take a breath right there. Just had to take a breath. What's also coming to mind is that while I was in the emergency room, in triage, waiting to be seen, bleeding because I was about to lose my first pregnancy, I was sitting there impatient, of course, and wondering, why the hell have I been sitting here for so long? And in getting up to inquire about that, in getting up to ask that question, it's as though I had to hold back a part of myself because of the stereotype of the angry Black woman. I didn't want to be the angry Black woman in the middle of this waiting room floor. And so, outside of just having a loss, there is just all this extra stuff that we have to deal with. And it creates so much stress, so much emotional distress, because we're constantly navigating biases. We're constantly navigating things that are embedded in every single space that we interact with. And it is stressful as fuck, right? And I, of course, have to go back to the experiments Nicole shared earlier. That was hard for me to hear. And I know that it's hard for us to face the parts of our past that are so painful, but it's the only way we heal. We don't heal by not facing things. We don't heal by hiding things in the closet. We don't heal by pretending as though they didn't happen and try to move on like everything is nice and dandy, right? We heal by actually facing them and doing so in a way that feels feasible, in doing so in a way that feels safe, but actually doing the work to face them. If you are the descendant of a Black person, it means that in your body, in your blood, in your cells, in your skin, you're carrying the memories and the stories. You're carrying the distrust and the fear, right? You're carrying that trauma. But that also means that we get to heal it. And today, there are so many resources that exist that did not exist when our parents were growing up, and our grandparents, and our great grandparents, and our great great grandparents. So it means that we have so much more access to our healing than they did, which also means that we get to do the work of our healing so that whatever hurt or trauma or fear we would pass on to our children, that becomes so much less because we're healing and clearing and processing all of that before we pass it on. So, my call to action for you, if you are a Black person, is that you find your tribes, you find the people who have your back, and ensure that you have the support you need as you're walking this path. I believe strongly that we need to let go of the persona of being strong and independent and having it on our own, right? Of course, we're distrustful of systems. Systems were created to harm us. Systems were created that we were intentionally excluded from. And I think now is a time when, everyone is seeing what's under the hood. Everyone is seeing the harm that has been done for years and years. And of course, if you're living in a Black body, you may have been living that, not observing it, but actually going through it. But as we move further and further towards our healing, I want us to be a bit more vulnerable. I want us to have the courage to let help in, to let support in from people that we can trust, right? And in that way, we get to do our healing. Every bit of healing that we do counts. Nicole also mentioned the medical industrial complex. So I know that this term might be new for many of you. I highly, highly recommend a documentary called The Business of Being Born. This documentary looks specifically at the birthing experience, so giving birth in a hospital. This documentary was also made several years ago, and everything pretty much still applies. Hospitals are businesses, and every intervention has a price to it. The interventions are sort of like clockwork, right? There is a small thing that starts, no big deal. We're just going to start this to help you to do this other thing, to help to support labor to start, or to help with this thing. And then that small intervention leads to another, it leads to another, until you are in the very same situation that you wanted to avoid to begin with. But like Nicole mentioned, when you are informed, then you're able to make decisions from that place of being informed. And so when you know that hospitals were built as businesses, when you know that this is how they operate, despite the well-meaning doctors that are there, they are trained to to give interventions. That is how they're trained. Nicole also mentioned that doctors are no longer trained to support the birth of babies who are breached. So, right now, if a baby is breached, that will likely lead to a C section, right? And I actually had not shared this story, but in my second pregnancy, that was a part of my story. My baby was breached, and what I was told was that basically the only option that I had was to have a C section. And because I was only about 6 months pregnant, I don't even think I had hit the 6 month mark. And my uterus was relatively small, then if I did have a C-section, the possibility existed that I would not be able to become pregnant again. Like those were the choices I was presented with. Either your baby dies, trying to deliver him vaginally in the breech position, or you have the C section and you risk not being able to become pregnant again. And that was bullshit because there are so many positions that I could have tried to help my baby to go into the optimal position, right? To come out headway. He could have also been born with his feet down, just that doctors aren't trained in doing that. And so, because that is no longer in their area of expertise, what was offered to me is what they knew, right? And so, I know that it might be hard to even process this idea that the systems that we trust and the systems that we rely on to care for us and to preserve our lives, that they're not always set up to benefit us. They're set up as businesses to benefit themselves. And so the more information that we have, the better choices that we can make. I was not planning to share that story, but it came to mind as I was mentioning the business of being born. So I highly recommend that documentary. Every birthing client that I work with, I include that in the resources that I share with them because I want them to see under the hood. I want them to see how the medical system is set up so that if they are giving birth within a hospital that has the conventional practices, then they know what to expect and we can work towards mitigating that, right? Or they also know that there are other choices in terms of where they can give birth. Okay, so definitely recommend that documentary. If you do not identify as a Black person, but consider yourself to be an ally, there's also work that you can do, right? Definitely focusing on your healing is a thing that everyone should be doing. And I also invite you to begin paying attention to how Black people are treated, to how you observe Black people being treated. Just begin noticing what differences exist. Something that I have been exploring on a more personal level is how mass media impacts our perception of experiences. So, definitely giving birth, we often see people screaming in a panic. The birthing person is yelling at their partner. It's like the most painful thing in the world, and it's really dramatic. Another documentary that I would recommend is Orgasmic Birth, which shows a very different perspective of the birthing experience. And I love recommending both The Business of Being Born and Orgasmic Birth because then, as a birthing person or an expectant parent, you get to see that it doesn't have to be this dramatic, painful thing. There are actually techniques and strategies and an environment that you can create that supports a birthing experience that feels safe, that feels gentle, and that isn't scary or dramatic. So definitely encourage that you check that out as well. In terms of just analyzing what is presented to us through mass media, what I did want to get to though is the stereotypes that we see on the big screen. And I've noticed that it's sort of the same stereotypes over and over again. And if you watch any movie that was created like 5, 10 years ago, then those stereotypes are even more blatant. Like I get angry watching movies all the time. Let's say that my husband and I are here trying to find something funny or entertaining. I often end the movie criticizing all of the stereotypes, all the different things that I saw and how terrible it was and how disappointed I am in mass media for presenting that. If you begin taking note, you will observe that Black people are often cast in sort of the same roles. So, the gangbanger, or the angry, feisty Black woman, or the person who goes through a lot of trials and tribulations, and finally they get to scrape their way to the top, right? Which again plays into the image of Black people being strong. So when you keep seeing that over and over again, then that is the perception that you form of Black people. Your expectation is that we're going to be stronger, we're going to be more resilient. Your expectation is that perhaps that we can put up with more difficulties because we're built to put up with more difficulties, right? And if you are the person who is in a hospital who's caring for a Black person, it means that unconscious bias that's within you, you decide who to prioritize. When someone calls out for help, you decide who needs the help more urgently based on who can handle pain, right? This is so deep, y'all. This is so deep, and it's not anything that we're going to resolve or fully address in a podcast. We've been trying to resolve and address this for years. But I think the more you know, the greater level of awareness you have, then the more that you can do in your individual life. When you observe something in a hospital, in a supermarket, in a taxi cab, on the streets, like you're able to flag injustice when you see it because now you're aware of the different ways in how it plays out, right? So I invite you to start taking note of what assumptions you see being made about different groups of people. And just think of the people in those groups that you actually know. And I'm sure they're a lot more colorful in real life, a lot more interesting outside of the 2D world that's on the big screen. I think when we decide to put the assumptions and the stereotypes aside and just really take people in for the fullness of who they are, the fullness of their beauty, then we get to create a world that is more just, and we get to create a world that is kinder. Okay? So obviously this episode was a big one. Obviously we talked about a lot of things that can be difficult to process. So take your time with this. Allow yourself some space to just see what's coming up for you, to journal, to take a walk, and to decide the world that you want to live in. and how you can play a part in creating that world. Okay? I'm sending you so much love, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.